He knocked me over. I landed on the dog bowl.
This one's wife. How do her parents see her? Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Very recently I received an email from a viewer who wanted to receive my insight into how this one's wife's narcissist parents view her. How do they see her business failures? How do they see her huge unpopularity? They asked, do they not see the failures? Do they not see the unpopularity? Or do they see it, but then dismiss it by, for instance, blaming the media or putting it down to racism? Or are they perhaps able to see it and they're rather pleased because of how she treats them? Or is it someone else? This viewer asked, do they see her bad behaviour in general? Or do they only see her bad behaviour towards them? Well, those are an interesting set of questions. So how do her parents see her? She is a narcissist, and so are both her parents. Different types, but they are. Accordingly, how do they view her? Well, they will see her through their narcissistic perspective, which means that they will see it through that lens of needing control. Now, one of the peculiarities about the way that the narcissist sees the world is that in some instances, the narcissist will see the world just as you do. And then, of course, there is the distortion field when it comes to the issue of control. And this is where the narcissist perspective of the world completely differs from yours and leads to a vast amount of confusion as you invariably try and reconcile the narcissist's behaviour, often not realising that they're a narcissist, applying your worldview when in actual fact you need to be applying the worldview of the narcissist. So, two examples of that. Let us say, for example, the narcissist was describing a tall, slender object which had lots of things sticking out of it that was a sort of grey-brown colour, and certain of these items were permanently green. Sometimes they were green during summer, had the green things growing on them, and that these green things changed colour at a particular point in the year. You would recognise this as that person is talking about a tree. Thus, the narcissist and the non-narcissist both see that object in a similar fashion. They would both describe it in a similar way. Thus, there's no distortion field applicable to the description of that tree. Let us take an instance where a narcissist has gone on a night out with his wife, and afterwards they're in the car driving home after going for dinner with another couple. And the male narcissist turns to his non-narcissist wife and says, have you noticed how Richard is always issuing little put-downs towards Kirsty? He's always issuing little jabs. Anything she says, he always tries to trump. He's always commenting about the things that she does, pointing out that she's done things wrong. He brings up things from the past, ridiculing her. Have you noticed that? And the wife turns and looks at her husband slack-jawed and says, you do that to me. He immediately goes, no, I don't. Now, he does, but what happens here is his narcissism allows him to see that unpleasant behaviour in someone else. It might even, if he has the knowledge, cause him to accuse Richard of being a narcissist. Thus, he can see those unpleasant behaviours in other people. But when his wife points out that he behaves that way, even though that is correct, the narcissism as a self-defense mechanism cuts in and denies that that's the case in order to nullify the threat to control posed by her accusation. Thus, he can see the behaviours in other people, but not himself. And thus, that answers part of the questions that have been posed in that, do they see the failures? They do. Both her father and mother will see where she has failed to carry something out. They will see that, for instance, American Riviera Orchard has gone nowhere. They will see, for instance, that Archetypes dropped off in terms of popularity and see the failure that occurred with Spotify. Thus, they will see it. They're not blinded to it. But given the fact that they can see these failings, can they also see how unpopular she is? They can. They are able to see that there is a lot of criticism about her. Now, how do they interpret that? Do they dismiss it, or do they embrace it? Well, of course, that all depends upon how they see this one's wife in terms of their own black or white thinking. Accordingly, let's take Doria, for example, because she interacts far more often with this one's wife than her father. Doria is a non-intimate secondary source in this one's wife's fuel matrix. This one's wife is a non-intimate secondary source in Doria's fuel matrix. I've talked about their interaction previously. On the basis that this one's wife is viewed as painted white by Doria, what it'll mean is she will see that she's unpopular, but because she's favourably disposed towards her daughter, she won't say, well, you deserve it because you're an utter twat. She will say, oh, ignore it, they're just envious of you. Or she'll probably get the word wrong and say jealous. Or she'll say, it's just the haters and the racists. Thus, Doria is perfectly capable of seeing that her daughter is unpopular, but when she's painted white, which she often will be, she will regard that failure of popularity as not being the fault of this one's wife and be supportive by way of false compassion and agree and suggest that it's down to people being hateful. Doria will see her daughter more regularly as painted white because this one's wife only interacts with her infrequently, and when they do, it's largely a favourable interaction. The reason being is that when a narcissist interacts with an appliance on an on-and-off basis, they are less likely to have the opportunity to offend the narcissist's need for control, meaning they're more likely to stay painted white. Furthermore, this one's wife can utilise Doria for facade management and also child-minding activities. Doria is benefited financially from her association with her daughter. Thus, they both gain residual benefits from one another, and they're able to control one another in a favourable, flattering way. There will have been instances where there have been clashes, but they will have been in the minority compared to the number of instances where they paint each other white. And thus with Doria, she will see her daughter's failures, she will recognise them, but she'll attribute them to something else, rather than it being the failing and unpopularity caused by her behaviour. With regard to Thomas, the situation will be different. He has been disengaged from by his daughter, which means that he will largely see her painted black. There will be instances where he will issue pity plays about, it's such a shame, she used to be such a lovely girl, we got on so well, I'd love to hear from her, which is his narcissism causing him to manage his facade to the public, rather than him saying, she's an absolute canut. After everything I've done for her, I can't believe she's treated me like this. She's ungrateful. Did you know that this is her third marriage? Did you know she'd had a hysterectomy, and smearing her and insulting her, etc.? He doesn't do that because his narcissism causes him to manage his facade to the world at large to maintain the appearance of the doting, caring father, which makes him look good, makes him seem like he's the one that's been hard done to, which is correct, he has been hard done to, so he's utilising the truth of that, and it's also a pity play. But remember, this is all being done for the prime aims. He may well privately slate her, smear her, and complain about the way that he's been treated by her. I don't doubt that he will do so to his other children, but publicly he does not do so. In terms of her unpopularity, because she's painted black, he will see that it is richly deserved. Of course, if he was asked about that, say in an interview that was broadcast, his facade management would come in, and therefore he would need to look like the caring father. And in the circumstances, he might say something along the lines of, well, she has done certain things which haven't helped with her popularity, but largely I think that's as a consequence of the media portraying her in a particular way, and some of it is driven by racism. He'll be supportive, not because he genuinely cares, but because his narcissism will dictate that it is appropriate for him to behave that way towards her in order to make him look good in the interview, thus allowing him to control the interviewer and those that are watching the interview or reading about it, and thus provide him with fuel. His view of his daughter, in the same way that Doria's view of her daughter, is all conditioned by the black or white thinking of the narcissism. Thus, Thomas will have her painted black because he's disengaged by her, and therefore he will see that she's unpopular, and for instance may well say to his son Thomas, she richly deserves it, after all look at the way that she's treated me, which will be part pity play and smearing. He may admit to somebody else about the unpleasantness of the way that she's conducted herself and lambast her for it and say, well, it's no wonder that many people hate her. After all, look at the way she treats me, look at the way she's treated Harry, look at the way she's treated Charles, etc. And thus, he won't make excuses for it. It won't necessarily be the case that he's secretly pleased, but rather it'll be a case of, well, I'm not surprised, and then it'll be about him. After all, look at the way she's treated me. Accordingly, both parents will be aware of her failures and her unpopularity. Doria, because she's more likely to see this one's wife as painted white, is more likely to just dismiss it as the basis of unsubstantiated media speculation and racist hatred, whereas Thomas, save where his facade management requires it, will view her as painted black and regard it as deserved as a consequence of the way that she has treated him. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.